Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Property Game Changers Live on the Property Game Changers Facebook page, where we talk with inspiring people who have changed the game in property. We're celebrating the power of ethical property investing to really change lives. We're debunking the myth that you need a lot of money to get started in property, and we're inspiring each other to believe bigger, to be bolder, and to be game changers for good. And our property game changers today is Gavin Gallagher of Earlsfort Group. Gavin is a property investor, entrepreneur, speaker, and podcast host of the incredibly popular Behind the Facade podcast. Gavin runs day-to-day operations of East Point Office Park. It's a 40-acre campus home to 50-plus corporate occupiers and their 9,000 employees. So grab a cup of coffee and join us as we welcome property game changer Gavin Gallagher.
Hello.
Hi, Gavin. How are you doing?
Very good. Thanks, Stephanie. Good to see you. Good to be here.
Good. It's phenomenal to have you on. I've been so excited and looking forward to getting to know more about you. But first of all, let's talk about Dominic.
Thank you. Yeah, my baby son, born, and believe it or not, born on my birthday. So,
wow.
Yeah. So it was an unusual birthday, to say the least. I was, I turned a certain age in the 40 bracket, and my son was born at 11 p.m. that evening. So we share the same birthday now.
Oh, that is phenomenal. Huge congratulations. He absolutely, you can see why they term it bundle of joy, because and he's such a beautiful wee thing. And you've also got 4 gorgeous daughters.
That's right. Yeah. It's funny, I have older daughters, and then I have a 3-year-old. And my older daughters I call my triple A. And I used to joke about, I had a AAA rating with the banks. And it's because my daughters are Amber, Ashley, and Alicia. And then my youngest daughter, Erica, is 3 years old. So she's at home sort of looking after with Dominic at the moment. So it's good.
Yeah, I saw a lovely picture of her with him. I'm the big sister as well, and there were just 2 of us. But I was so excited when Nikki was born. I just couldn't get enough of her, showing her. And as she got a little bit older, you get a chance to show her everything, and she was always so interested in everything. And it's great to just take a moment to think about the family life. But you're big in property, and for many people, they kind of started, but you kind of grew up in the property world. So tell us a little bit about your earlier life and getting started in property.
Well, for me, it was basically like from childhood, because my father and my grandfather were both in the house building game, and it started. In fact, if you go way back, my grandfather was living in the UK during World War II, and he went over there with his brothers. They were a west of Ireland kind of rural kind of agriculture family, and the guys got into building, went to the UK, and it was during the war they were building military barracks for the army, and then after the war they were rebuilding from all of the bombing damage and things like that. So they made a name for themselves, the Gallagher kind of brothers. And then my grandfather came back and built quite a big house building company. And when he died, my father took it over, and then they sold that business, and they got into commercial real estate. And so, but then my father died at a young age. At 45, he died, and I was just turning 21. I was in the middle of studying architecture, and it was a sudden kind of thrown into the deep end in a big way. And I mean, I had always been in the property industry, and I can remember as a child being brought to building sites, and because my dad would be going in to check on progress or something like that, and I'd be brought along. And so, I'd always be in building sites from a young age with houses going around. But I kind of, just because you're there, it's familiar, but you're not, you don't know the inner workings of it necessarily. Mm-hmm. And I went on a holiday with the parents to New York City when I was about 15 or 16. And I was just blown away by the skyscrapers, and like looking back, you get a sore neck looking at all these massive things. And I came back absolutely obsessed with becoming an architect, because I wanted to do something kind of impressive like that.
Mm.
And so I came back, got into architecture, was studying. I was in third year, and Dad went on a business trip to Africa. And while he was there, he got very, very ill. And they didn't have the medical support team that he would have needed to kind of, and he got progressively worse. They managed to get him back to Ireland, but he died about 2 months later from his illness. And I found myself and my mother, who was completely sheltered from the business side of it. We were suddenly in the middle of a very active businessman who had multiple investments. He had developments underway, millions borrowed by the banks, and all of this stuff going on. And we were all pretty much thrown in the deep end and didn't know what to do. So it was a sink or swim kind of a moment.
Wow, what an opening. You've got to write a book, Gavin.
I'm working on it at the moment, believe it or not.
You do realise that, yeah, there's a book in there. I've actually listened to your Behind the Facade podcast where you do go into that story in some detail, and it's definitely worth a listen. But can you tell us, Gavin, how do you cope with that sort of stress at, or just that sort of situation at the age of 21? I mean, for many people now, if they turned around tomorrow and suddenly they owe the banks millions and there's multiple developments going on, they would not know where to turn. So how did you navigate?
Yeah, that is that. I'll tell you what, one of the first things, one of the motivations behind my podcast is actually like I didn't have, I had a couple of mentors, and they were so helpful in getting your head, sort of in the right place. And so being able to ask somebody questions that are above your level of expertise is super important. And I have a lot of expertise now, and so I feel my way of kind of giving back is putting some of this expertise out there for free and just let people. Now, I do get approached by a lot of the audience of my podcast asking very specific questions, and I try to be as helpful as possible with specific answers and stuff like that. But it's really, to get out there and just to ask, and that's what I had to do when my father died. I took a job. I took a year off college, and I took a job working with an architect who was working in the family business, in some of the family projects. He was actually employed by the family business, and he kind of took me under his wing and kind of steered me in the right direction. And he was just super helpful. And he also instilled a load of good habits in me, but he wasn't a property developer. He was an architect. So I got that side of the business, and then I started getting involved in my own stuff, and I started, getting more ambitious and borrowing greater sums of money and stuff. And I didn't have very many mentors in that regard. So I was kind of learning on the job, but I did have a good team around me for the existing family business. So that was helpful. So I think you got to have some people around you that have your best interests at heart. We did have a couple of people that did not have the best interests at heart, and they, lining up deals to buy it cheap for themselves and all of this kind of stuff. I mean, we went through some really sort of learning, let's just say painful learning experiences where guys that you believed were advising you were actually, taking basically out of your pocket and things like that. So you do have to be on your, you really do have to be dialed in and on your game for these kind of things. But having a couple of trusted advisors, friends that you really trust, that you can rely on to kind of have a conversation with, those are super useful people to have. Somebody that doesn't have an axe to grind or some sort of a strategic benefit from a position that, you could let them in on. And so when people ask for my advice in the podcast, I mean, I have no benefit to gain from giving. I'm just going to give them an honest answer. But if you ask the wrong person, you can get lined up to be fed to the wolves. And so I learned some of these lessons kind of painfully.
Yeah, it is tricky. I was just thinking about that because when you're an honest person, you wouldn't believe, well, at the start anyway, you wouldn't believe that other people are going in there and they're just going to lie to your face. It's not just that they haven't mentioned, it's just that they're actually going to lie, mislead, deceive.
Fraud. Yeah.
And there's so much money in property. I just think it's so unnecessary. there's so much value you can deliver and
So
so
true.
much money you can make, so much good you can do, that it's just totally unnecessary. I was just thinking that we recently bought a 12-unit property last year, and as we were going through we were told when we were viewing it we couldn't see one room, so you know what's coming next, Gavin. So we hadn't realised what was coming next, and it actually turned out he said he didn't have the key for that particular room.
Red flag, red flag.
Exactly. We did not see the red flag go up. But it was a master key, it turned out, Gavin. So obviously all the rooms were opened by that one key. So, but he didn't have the key for that one room, so we didn't see that one room. However, we did learn of the issue because my sister is eagle-eyed. So one of the things came back from the fire inspection that there's a big hole in the roof.
Wow.
But he actually said it had all been repaired up to the standards. And we were given some bad legal advice at that stage, which was that we should just get an indemnity against in case. But what I learned now is that you should always take the money now. So if there's something wrong, get your discount now. Indemnity don't always work out. But I've gone off on a piece. I try not to do that now and say this happened to me. But yes, it's so important to be able to maintain your integrity, but also be able to deal with people who do not have such high standards.
True.
So you started off, Dominic, navigating all of that and finding a way through it and finding a way out of it without losing everything, which is epic in itself. Tell us what happened from there. Where did your property journey go?
Well, I mean, we had there's a couple of years of a story to kind of go through, but really, I was involved in the family business, and the family business had various people involved, like my father's cousins and things like that. And so when you're in that situation, family businesses can be difficult at times. And I kind of initially bristled against the controls of all these other people. And my dad, but when he was alive, had always said, don't work in a family business, go and do your own thing. So I had always had it in my mind, and a kind of entrepreneurial in spirit to kind of go out and do my own thing. So I was running my own architectural practice, and I pivoted into development management and project management, and that got me kind of at the coalface, working with other clients on deals, and I started doing my own deals as well. And so I bought a couple of properties that just really did very well, and just happened to get the timing right. But of course, with all these things, when you're in a market that is rising, and the Celtic Tiger, was just a runaway train. I mean, it was an incredible time to be around. And you start to believe that you're the reason for all of this success. You don't realize that the entire market has been lifted. It's not that you're this specific genius and everyone else is losing money, but you're the one person who's making money. The entire market was rising. They were doing it with huge amounts of debt and stuff. And of course, I jumped on the debt junkie train like everybody else. I mean, the entire country and the entire world was in this kind of euphoria and denial that there was something unusual about this. And I can remember borrowing money with just literally a phone call to the bank, and some of the deals were, ridiculously good deals that I should not have assumed were repeatable, and but of course everyone likes to think that they're a genius during the moment. And so bought a property, borrowed I think it was 2.3 million, borrowed 110%. I mean, I didn't have to put anything in at all. And I basically put the deposit down using borrowed money, borrowed all the money to buy it, borrowed the stamp duty and the legal costs and all that, borrowed all that, and started working on it. And then a month later, an agent friend of mine approached me and asked me, did I buy that property in a certain location? I said, yeah, that's mine. I just closed like a month ago. And he goes, my client wants to buy that property from you. And they were a credit union. And so financial institution, and for whatever reason, this particular deal, it had a financial institution planning permission that was necessary. So I was in the perfect position and the perfect timing, and I extracted 1 0.5 million profit from them in the space of 6 weeks. And having borrowed 100%, I made over 1.5 million profit on this. And what was incredible was just in a couple of weeks, and I can remember thinking like, geez, I'm a complete and utter genius. Like, I mean, so I started, buying like holiday homes in Spain and all this kind of stuff. And then I did it again another couple of times, but in different areas. And what I didn't stop to think, I go on about the 3 E's, as I call them. And it's the ego, the emotion, and the economy are the 3 E's. And one of those, if not all of them, will take you down at some point in your career. And in my case, all 3 were firing at all cylinders, and I was getting the ego. I was, starting to think that I had done everything here, that none of this was related to the market. And then the emotional side to it, where you kind of start to think, I can do nothing wrong. Therefore, stop being so analytical on the deals and just start going on gut instinct, which I did. And then the economy came along and crashed in 2008 with the financial crash. And I was deep in a huge deal that I did in Spain, and it was a 42 million euro deal down in the south of Spain. It was a shopping center, and I got into the deal. I put in about 3 million of my own equity, and I got other investors to put the other 9 million in, including various family members of mine, and then we borrowed 30 million. And we went after this, and it was going to be the next kind of Bond Street in the sun, we'll call it. The idea was a luxury boutique on waterfront on a marina with all these luxury yachts floating right beside all of the shops. So it was going to be a beautiful, people talk about Puerto Banús back in the 1970s and stuff being this amazingly kind of glamorous place. And that's what I had envisioned, Mm-hmm. And 2009, absolutely nobody renting shops in the place. I mean, completely empty. All of the deals that I had lined up in advance all fell by the wayside. And I was stuck with a 42 million euro investment at zero income, like absolutely zero income. So the banks started to come after me. The investors started to come after me. Like everything went pretty hairy pretty quickly. And it's bad enough dealing with just that one negative deal, but the rest of the market was collapsing at the same time. And so all of the kind of property deals that I had that were feeding a lot of rental income to me for just passive income, the banks started to call in loans on those and stuff. And so it was like this domino effect that started to happen. So I think I was about 6 or 7 years fighting fires on a daily basis, trying to stave off bankruptcy. And it got so close that I was actually talking to bankruptcy administrators and things like that about, what date should I trigger this? And then it just seemed that the market was just turning the corner just before that took place. And I thought I'll give it another few months and I'll try to kind of dig my way out of this. And again, I went back to Ireland and got involved with the family business and got some help from my brother. And we basically kind of rebuilt things. But it was it was like the crucible, they just that period of time when I thought the whole world was going to kind of just collapse. And so it was difficult, very, very difficult. And now I'm back running the business park here that the family business was involved in back in the 1990s building. And so I found that it suits my kind of mindset to be involved in the big commercial kind of office properties and stuff like that.
Well, I take it back, Gavin. It needn't be a book. It needs to be a film. Because you've just described in a few minutes, but I just want to go into every nook and cranny because I can see why people were saying that. How did you get through it? Because as you said, to have one deal with 42 million pounds in it, friends and families, millions of pounds down in it, and it zero revenue. And also here you've got all of your rest of your portfolio and, different calls of different lenders every day saying, we want our money back. So I do want to spend a few moments here just to say, how do you get up every day and deal with that? How did you, and what year? Let's talk about what year. You know, when you said the bankruptcy and you managed to stave it off and you dug your way out, what year were we by then? So give us a little bit more
It was, if I remember correctly, it was January of 2014. So I was 6 years into it at that stage. And the thing is like with all these things, everyone talks about the 2008 financial crash, but that's not when your troubles begin. That's when the event that will trigger all of your troubles begins. And you don't immediately notice this. So 2008, the crash came. I had borrowings all over the place and I had deals everywhere. I had a lot of deals that were in train that you can't get out of because you have to build them out before you can sell them and all this. I had 2 transactions that were actually in the legals. So the lawyers were trying to sell them and both buyers pulled out of those deals because of what they saw happening in the market. And that was the kind of the beginning of the dominoes, because I was going to make a 2 million profit on one of those transactions, and that was going to bring cash in that was going to allow me to shore up other stuff. And then this other deal that I was doing was going to bring in about a 1.5 million profit. And that, you know, the two of them both going at the same time, I didn't anticipate both. I might have anticipated, you know, the chance of one of them falling over, but not both. And so I had made various commitments to banks to pay off debt from those sales. Suddenly that wasn't possible. And I had just moved to the south of Spain to actually manage this big sort of shopping center deal. So I was now living in a house in the south of Spain. I had my family down there. I had my children were very young and they were going to school down there. And so on top of all of that, it ended up, all of the stress and strain and stuff triggered the end of my marriage as well. So that threw an extra bit of stress into the whole thing. And it was kind of, initially you don't realize that how much difficulty you're going to be in. You start to get glimpses of it, but you think that, you know, what's an average recession last? Maybe 2 years and then you're out of it. So I kind of thought to myself, right, I just need to keep these guys at bay for 2 years and then I'll have weathered the storm and prices will bounce back and we'll get out of this situation. But like the prices just went down, down, down. I had a portfolio that dropped in value by 80%. Wow. And, you know, most people would assume 50% is like the maximum drop that you could expect, but 80%. So I was at the worst point, I was 16 million negative. And I was in a position where it was just every bank that I was involved in, that I had been this like star customer. And I used to send my bank managers hampers at Christmas. They'd be waiting for Gavin's gifts, you know, because there'd be a huge hamper with like 10 bottles of wine and stuff. So they were always waiting for my call, you know, because they wanted to take care of me. Those guys were replaced. Some completely new team would be brought in, no relationship whatsoever. As far as they're concerned, this guy owes us millions and don't believe a word out of his mouth. All of the previous relationships, all of them disappear. So it's extremely difficult, but it doesn't happen in one go. It's this accumulation of kind of happenings. And so it starts with the domino and then another domino, another. And before you know it, by about 2012, everything was just completely in oblivion. You know, I was traveling around the world trying to find work to actually keep the bill, you know, pay bills basically, because the banks, the passive income that you have from all of your rental income properties and stuff, the banks close down all that. They have things called full rental sweep, where every single penny, even though they collect the interest and there's usually a surplus left over, they have the right to step in and take every single penny of the interest of the payment. So that little surplus that you might have had that will kind of keep your operations going, they pull that as well. So but it doesn't happen on day one. If it happened on day one, most people would just give up. But it's this death by 1,000 cuts, as I call it. And every day you're kind of another phone call, somebody else pulling in something, and you're like, oh, when will it end, So the way I kind of dealt with it was I kind of took a couple of days off, and I just went to kind of a hotel, and I checked into a hotel, and I was completely alone to kind of just get my thoughts completely where I need to be. And I'm a guy that will take out a journal, and I will write for hours and hours and hours, all of my, trying to kind of strategically plan what's going to happen, how can I deal with each problem, and try to build kind of a chart of what are the priorities, how you're going to deal with them. The problem is when you have 25 priorities, it's very hard to understand which one is the one that you need to deal with. So you got to kind of figure out what's the one that is most critical right now. And so I was working on that, and I came out of it, and I said, the most important thing is my mindset and my health. And, there's no point digging out of this and finding that my health is so damaged that survival actually isn't worth it, because you come out the other side and you've got stress related kind of, people get cancer and all sorts of things from stress. So I kind of thought, I've got to make sure that no matter what happens, I keep the health in order. So I started getting really, really heavily into my health, and started exercising religiously. And that would be the very first thing I did. So go out in the morning, first thing in the morning, and do a big long run or a cycle or something. And that just gave me time to think, but also keep your health in check. So that was a big game changer in a sense, because just once you've got that, you can deal with more stress if you're healthy and fit. And if you're, eating fast food and working late at night and doing all this kind of stuff, you might get through it, but you might come out, you might not like what you see at the other side of it. So I kind of thought, make sure you get your priorities right, because your wealth, your health is your wealth. There is no wealthy success if you're, lying in a hospital bed. So, and so that was kind of where I came from. So I took a kind of holistic approach to it in that way.
And I'm really, that's very interesting. I love that you had the insight to think of that, because when we're in the midst, it's when we have our least thinking capacity. When we're under stress, under pressure, we're being attacked, is we have least thinking capacity. So I really like the way that you took that space. But I'm curious. So I'd love it if you could tell us about, how did you strategically think, okay, I've got, 60 million in Spain, I've got owed, I've got, this portfolio, I've got this rental income, although you couldn't see any of it. What am I going to do? What am I going to sell? Or I suppose you couldn't sell if it's 80% down, but how did you just sort of, at a high level, how did you strategize? What am I actually going to do here to get through this?
Well, a certain amount of it was delay and obfuscate, because you're in it. You're basically, the intention at the time was that, or my belief at the time was that this was a 2-year thing. And so because it's a 2-year thing, you're thinking, okay, all I need to do is keep the banks at bay. If they force assets to be sold at the bottom of the market, then you're going to end up with all of the residual debt, but you're not going to have the asset anymore. And so the idea was to kind of delay and obfuscate in that way, so that at the very minimum, you say to them, okay, let me go and do a full review of the portfolio, and let me figure out what assets should be sold. And that gives you a month, 3 months, whatever it is. And then when you go back and you say, right, well, we've done this, but we need further analysis of this one. And you kind of, that was the intention. The problem is I'd never expected it to get to 6 years, and it wasn't possible to last 6 years. What they started to do was to appoint liquidators and examiners, and they'd say, right, and suddenly I find that the property that I bought for 2.5 million was sold for 700,000. And it was, once they started doing that, it got extremely difficult, because now you've got a residual debt, but you don't have the asset actually to return in value to actually get yourself out of that. And I kept on saying to them, if you sell it at this price, there's no coming back. Like, you cannot, the market could rebound and the property will go from 700 to 1.5. Even if it doesn't go to the full 2.5, it's still $1 million of extra value. But they had all of these, this is the problem with banks. They're completely irrational when you're in that situation. And so they basically dragged me into this thing, the bad bank. And everyone in the bad bank, there's the good bank and the bad bank. If you're the good bank, you're the guy that has no, bad debt. If you're in the bad bank, you're basically like a prison cell. You're in a prison cell, and they're like, prison wardens, and they just don't trust a word you're saying. And so it was very, very difficult, because you'd be going in with business plans that you've spent time working on, and no, we're not doing that. We're just going to sell this, and so it took a lot of patience to kind of work with these guys, and some of them, it was a stupid idea. I mean, some of these guys, in the end, there was all these kind of debt forgiveness programs that they did, and they ended up writing off a load of that debt, and so they took the loss rather than allowing me to kind of like fight the battle and and I think that's one of the big mistakes that the banks make in these situations, is that rather than, nobody wants to lose it all and get themselves into this situation. They will fight harder than any bank manager will fight. But they were dealing with thousands of customers all in the same position. And so they just took this kind of, scattergun approach, and basically everyone is just going to be treated the same way. It was a difficult, it was particularly frustrating, which is why I'm glad I had my fitness to rely on, because there was times when you just want to pull your hair out dealing with some of these guys.
Yeah. Gavin, thank you for that insight there. Sometimes I feel like tearing my hair out just going through one application with a lender, or where you ask for all the information, you provide all the information requested in the format requested, and then 6 months later, when you're due to complete, you're asked for a load of other information that's never been mentioned before.
Yeah.
But no, that was really interesting. I know that is part of the reason why you've started up your property podcast, but it's a different kind of podcast than the typical property podcast. So tell us a little bit more about Behind the Facade.
Well, yeah, the idea of Behind the Facade is to kind of explore the mental game and the mindset that is required for success in real estate. Or I would even say success in general, and success in business and investment. There's a whole lot of emotional cues that we take, and we make decisions on, in the spur of a moment, and there's all these shortcuts. My latest episode that went out yesterday was on the cognitive bias that we have. And these are sort of mental shortcuts that we don't even realize that we're taking, but they're there, and they can often damage you ultimately. So I got into the podcast during the lockdown because I had this kind of extra spare time. And I thought to myself at the outset, there's a lot of young guys out there trying to get into property. They don't know, they don't have, say, the knowledge, they don't have the skills, they don't have a mentor. Maybe I can be that mentor, maybe I can help out. But then there's a kind of an even deeper side to it. And that is what I saw through some family tragedy on my side. The two of my close relatives took their own lives because of stress related from, financial issues and depression and things like that. And when you see that impact and what it does to the family that's left behind and stuff, you'll never forget it. And so from my point of view, I want to make sure that people are fully aware of the difficulty that you can get yourself into if you don't watch what you're doing. Some of the shortcuts that I took, I was getting hugely successful. I made millions in the space of a couple of years. And that feeds into this kind of belief that you can do no wrong. And you start getting into bigger deals and more ambitious. And you start living this lifestyle where, you need thousands every month just to kind of keep the bills paid, and you get to this point where it's very hard to turn back and go back. And when you do have to go back, a lot of these guys that I know that, that took their lives and stuff, they had a very good lifestyle, and suddenly they had to dial it right back. And a lot of the time, people's ego is tied up in that whole, persona that they're super successful. Look at the car I drive, look at the watch I'm wearing. And when you're suddenly having to kind of like replace the car with a with kind of a cheap car, it's very public, and it's a kind of it damages someone's ego. And unless you've got the resilience to kind of take that, it can really do harm to you. So I try to get people to have some restraint and to kind of know what they're doing, build resilience. Don't think that this is an overnight success game. This is a very long-term game. You can become enormously successful, but you have to have patience and discipline, and you're not going to get there overnight. You can take the gambles and they may pay off. But as I learned the hard way, the economy at some point, nobody saw COVID-19 back in December. I mean, let's take out your diary and have a look at what your plans were for 2020. And I bet you they're not what it turned out to be. And that is the kind of thing I'm talking about. People think, let's go and borrow a load of money. The market's only going one direction, and suddenly COVID comes out of nowhere. You can find yourself in a great deal of trouble. And unless you have the resilience and maybe the family, behind you that can actually support you, you could find yourself in a very, very dark place. So trying to bring awareness to that and help people on their journey. And thankfully, I think I'm getting through to a lot of people, because I'm getting some nice feedback from them, sort of telling me that, thanks, you prevented me from making a mistake, from buying such and such a thing. And so it's going in the right direction.
And you were telling me earlier, Gavin, that it's got a very global audience, just 20% from the UK and the rest from all over the world.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I cultivated a global audience because I'm very sort of widely read when it comes to the news and podcasts. I listen to podcasts in the US and Australia and all sorts of stuff. And because of that, I didn't want it to be like, I live in Ireland. I didn't want it to be an Irish focused podcast where it's only a local Irish audience. And then I thought, okay, the UK is definitely a target market, but I don't want it only to be exclusively the UK either. So I talk about the universal sort of truths of investing rather than specifics, getting into a particular tactic that would work, say, in the UK, but wouldn't work in the US. And that's why the mindset is good, because it is applicable across the board, no matter what country you're in. These same emotions come to the front and kind of dictate what you do. And so I try to kind of steer people away from and just make them aware that you're not even aware that this is happening, but your brain is telling you this. So a lot of the podcasts are kind of spent, advising on that kind of stuff.
There's a couple of really interesting things in what you've said. And one about is the identity and what makes you feel successful. Is it who you are as a person? It's probably a mixture of things for most people, including the external, we call them trappings of success, because they can be a trap. But I would just, that's one thing that really interests me. And the other thing is, I'm guessing now going forward for your investing, you're still investing, but you have rules that are guiding your investment moves. And I would be really interested in talking about both of those aspects. So let's talk for a minute about what advice do you give to somebody? Because many of us are very attached. We may not even know it consciously to the external trappings of success, if you will. What advice would you give to somebody? What should we be doing to help us to be more resilient?
Well, I think there's a few things that this is drawing on some of the cognitive bias that I was talking about in the podcast. There's a thing called restraint bias, and it's the inability to appreciate how weak your discipline will be in the face of temptation. So when you start making all this money coming in, you might say to yourself, before you have it, that I'll be very sensible and I'll put so much of it, I'll pay off the debt with this much, and I'll put so much of it into investment, and I'll put a little bit aside for the rainy day. But then it lands in your bank account, and the emotion kind of gets in the middle of it, and your ego, and suddenly, no, I think I'll buy a brand new Range Rover, and I think I'll fly the family to the US first class, and we'll spend it, have a fantastic holiday. And those are nice things to do, but you get used to all of that, and it's very hard to turn back. So I found, I took a first class business seat for my 2-year-old daughter. and like we flew over to the US. I think it cost, I can't remember, like tens of thousands, like to buy flights for the US. And because money was like falling from the sky, it seemed at the time. But then fast forward to the crash, and like just that one flight alone would have covered like 3 or 4 months of living expenses. And you suddenly realize, so you have to understand this is a long-term game. And guys that come into money quickly, you have to kind of realize that you're not a genius, that the whole market gets captured and caught by these very same problems. If you go out there and if you spend the money on the flash car so that your friends are impressed with you, that is a slippery slope. And I mean, I love cars, so it's difficult, but the restraint is there. What you've got to understand is that living on borrowed funds, like having equity releases to fund all of this stuff, is a really bad idea. If you take an equity release out to pay for something that is not an investment, then all you've done is grown your debt. You haven't actually added to your wealth in any way. So I think you got to you got to understand that it takes discipline. And if you want to build a sustainable, wealth, and if you want to kind of continue to be able to enjoy it as you get older and older, what you want to do is just put all of that stuff aside. I mean, look at the big game, look at the future, and have kind of, the picture of millions coming in passive income and you being very comfortable. But if you decide that I want to short circuit all that and I just want the trappings of that wealth, but I want it today, then you'll never get to the passive income in the future. All you're doing is pulling the debts forward. And that is something that I think a lot of people don't realize. And they think to themselves, oh, sure, I'll pay it off the next time that I make the big profit. And so it's this reluctance to wait for reward. It's this like premature reward. You want to get paid upfront, and that's the very, very sort of start of this domino effect. That you go in, you do that, then in 3 years' time, your car's looking a bit old. I'll just do the same thing again. Now you've just grown your debt again. Whereas if you had not done it in the first place, you could have a situation where you've actually got now 3 or 4 extra properties, all kind of working towards paying you. And so there's a certain amount of that. And I mean, everybody likes to take a little bit of a reward now and then, but just don't let that outward appearance guide you and make you do stupid things that, the market will stop when it decides to stop. It'll not be by your decision. And so you will be caught. You'll have just taken out that loan, and then tomorrow the market could actually, something like COVID could happen. And 3 months from now, you're in a really difficult situation. Who would have seen it? Nobody sees it. So from that point of view, I think just bear that in mind.
So I would love to get a little glimpse into your rules, because you've got investment rules that help you to achieve some of the stability that you were just talking about. And maybe I'm sure that your rules are going to be very, very different to the investment rules that somebody who's just beginning might have, or somebody at a different phase from you. But I'd love a little insight into what are the rules that you think about now in terms of investing, in terms of how much equity and borrowing on each property. Could you give us a little insight on that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there's a kind of a sort of a basic structure that I have that I call it the 6 R's. And you might have heard me mention these before, but my 6 R's are roadmap, restraint, resilience, reserves, reputation, and relationships. And those are something that you kind of need to have under control right from the word go before the rules come into it. Because a lot of people, they go out there and it's like a scattergun approach. So the roadmap, the idea is that you kind of have a vision for where you want to be, what your future looks like. And once you have a crystal clear view of what your future looks like, you now can kind of create the strategy to get there and the path to get there, and to come up with kind of a realistic path to get there. So restraint is one of the things, and I mentioned that already, not to be going off and doing all this kind of stuff. Resilience, we've mentioned already. That is going to be super important because it is a totally cyclical market and you are going to be caught out, and you need to be aware that no matter how good it's going today, a year or two from now, there's going to be some event that triggers a negative growth cycle, and you may end up with the value of your assets below what you bought them at, and so that is all very important. Reserves is another thing. Having, a buffer put aside, having cash that you can rely on at any time. When I was going through all of this stuff, I was literally borrowing from Paul to pay Peter. I was, I had to pay a debt. What am I going to do with it? Okay, sell that property, take that equity release, pay this guy. I never had cash sitting there because I was invested everywhere. And the idea of investing everywhere is because it was a rising market. And so that was a bad habit I got into. And you don't realize that the market can stop, and all of these midway, projects are all going to go negative at the same time. Reputation and relationship are the last two. Your reputation is really important. And so, we talked about this before we went live about, the importance of being kind of honest and having integrity. And there are guys out there that are going to try to rip you off and stuff. So don't be one of those guys, because your word becomes your bond, and people will kind of back you up because of that. And then relationships with tenants and things like that. I've worked hard on building relationships with all of the tenants here in the business park that I run. And we have about 50 different corporate occupiers, and they normally employ about 9,000 people. Since COVID came along, it's a little bit different, but having those relationships really helps a lot, because you can create deals from just knowledge of what is going on in your tenant's mind. Now, this might be more commercial than the kind of residential area, but if you know what people are doing, whether they're expanding, whether they're shrinking, you can have an idea of whether there's a deal to be put together for that particular tenant. And if you have a good relationship and a good reputation, you can actually create and originate new deals out of thin air through those relationships. Going out and buying a property and trying to find a tenant, that is hard work. Having the tenant before you buy the property is the way to go about it. So those are some of the basic kind of principles that I work around. When it comes to, that's an example. Friend of mine, when I moved to Dubai for a few years, and when I was there, one of my friends was already living there, and he had built up all this great relationships, and he convinced one of the biggest banks in Dubai. They were in 6 different buildings, and he convinced them to consolidate into one single building that he was going to build for them. And so I was involved in that project, and it was a huge project, like 240,000 square feet of office, 18-story building, and the annual rent was maybe 20 million or something like that. But this was a major deal. The guy had the lease signed and all of the value created before he bought the land. And so that is something. Now, going out, and it's not always possible to do that, but it is certainly a way of mitigating your risk. I went off and I bought a site, and hopefully I can turn this site around and I can make money on it. And those kind of deals, when you make them work, you can make a lot of money, but it can also go completely the opposite direction and can drag you down. So you have to be very careful. Some of the rules I have now are not to take these wild, completely black or white deals where you're either going to be a successful superhero at the other side of it, or you're going to be like in the ground. And those were the kind of deals I didn't realize at the time, but I was taking those kind of gambles and throwing the dice and basically like flipping a coin, whether you're a success or not. So we got to mitigate your risks as best as possible. And by doing that, you kind of go out, you get your tenants, you meet your tenants, you try to kind of get them signed up so that you don't have the opportunity to have a big void. And a lot of the time, what you've got to do is take your, let's say, take your year, you've got to give something to the tenant to make it worth their while doing this. They know that you're going to make money on this deal, so you got to make it worth their while. So one of the things that we used to do is, you give them a certain amount for free, a certain amount of rent for free or whatever. And it might be a year's rent free to kind of get them to agree. So they've got a whole year of rent to look forward to. Maybe you'll fund a portion of their fit out or whatever, because that can be an expensive, or you'll rentalize it. So you spread the cost over so many years. Those are all great things, but you won't do that if you don't have the reputation and if you don't have the relationships. But that's how we're doing it now. We don't really want to go out and make these kind of crazy wild bets. Now, as the market falls, I do think COVID is going to have a very negative impact on the market. I don't think we've seen anything yet. I think we're looking at a couple of difficult years ahead of us. When all of the stimulus runs out and things like that, that's when it'll actually start to get difficult. So I think it could start to fall. And obviously when the market falls, then there's opportunities to buy and things like that. So that is, those cyclical moments only come around every decade or so. So you've got to be kind of ready. So I think people should be kind of getting prepared and lining up for the possibility of taking advantage of distressed prices in a year or two. But I don't think, I see a lot of people buying at the moment, and I think it's a little bit premature. I think it could simply be that there's a lot of pent up demand because people couldn't do anything during lockdown. And so a lot of people have, they wanted to buy something, they wanted to make a move, whatever it is. And that is all pent up demand that is being satisfied now that the market reopened. But we have yet to see the kind of the negative impact on the market that this, knock to the economy is going to do. So it's a little bit of a dark couple of years ahead of us, I suspect, and I'm getting kind of ready in that regard.
Yeah. Well, let's move on now, because actually you talked a little bit about COVID. You're running this monster business park, and you've probably got lots of other things going on as well. So we've kind of gone in detail through a lot of different things, but give us a picture of what your life looks like now from a property perspective.
Yeah, it's quite different, I can tell you. Back in January, I had just met with all of our tenants, and we have about 50 corporate occupiers in 37 buildings, and they all they contribute towards a service charge. And we had agreed that we were going to do various works around the park, that we were going to put in cycle lanes, and we were going to improve and put in bus stops, and there was various things that we wanted to make improvements. And everyone was all fully agreed, fully on board to do that, because we have 9,000 people on a kind of typical day. We have a bus service that transports 3,500 people a day on a typical day. 2,500 people drive in every day on a typical day, and maybe 1,000 people cycle a day on a typical day. So there's a lot of moving parts there, and that can be a lot of work. And I have a whole team here that helps me with that. We have a security team, we have a landscaping team, we have our own bus crews and stuff. And that would be my life before COVID hit. We have a business park for 9,000 people with maybe 200 people in it. It is really, really different. And like the car parks are all empty. Our bus service transports about 30 people a day. So it's an absolute fraction. And so that being the case, first thing is we're trying to look at ways to bring down the service charge, because tenants do not want, they don't want to be paying rent, but they have no choice. But service charge is something that you can dial back. So we're looking at that. That is some of the stuff. In the longer term, what I'm thinking about is, where is the future of the office going? Because it's a very difficult thing to kind of figure out now. You've got this work from home experiment that we've all been a part of, is changing the kind of the dynamic in work. And I think there's a huge number of people that are starting to kind of think, I don't want to go back to an office. I'd like to sort of work from home. And so there's going to be a change in habits, and I think there's going to be a change in work. But I do think there's a drawback to working from home as well. If you don't have a house that is, a lot of people live in, modest accommodation that doesn't have, say, a room to work in or whatever. It's very difficult to work in a kitchen table when you've got children and things like that. So I think a lot of people are going to want to come back to work, but I think the businesses are going to want to have a different thing. So I'm putting a lot of time and thinking into that. And I was working on a book prior to COVID that was going to be all around the workplace, and now I'm having to adapt that. and I'm also working on a book that kind of goes into the behind the facade kind of mindset and telling my story a little bit more detail. But so my day at the moment, I start every day with a lot of exercise. I actually signed up for an Ironman event next year, so I'm in training at the moment, and but I come into the office and we do our best to basically try to kind of manage a situation that is very, very uncertain at the moment. And we have, teams of people that are thinking to come back to the office, and then a government notification comes out about COVID and they change their plans or they delay them. And so many of our tenants are multinationals with headquartered in America or whatever. So a lot of the problems that they have in the US are dictating how they're acting with their workforce here. So it's a very, very different day. Every day is different. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And I wish we had time to go into all the things I'd love to go into, but one little, just a fun question. So you had those years where you were making millions in weeks, lots of weeks of the year. A typical deal was netting you a 1.5 million, 2 million, and so on. And so tell us about some of the highs, or the frivolities, the indulgences, and the
indulgences. Well, I'll tell you. What I did was I had a beautiful Audi sports car, and it was an RS4. But before I bought that car, I had this kind of top of the line Audi A6, and the guy that sold it to me invited me to this thing called the Audi driving experience, and it's where you go off to this racetrack and they bring all the hottest cars that they have in their production to it, and they let us drive these with race drivers and stuff like that. And I drove this RS4 for the first time. And I remember just thinking, oh my God, like I love this car. And I just went back and the guy said, so Gavin, did you enjoy that? And I said, you damn right. Well, no, I enjoyed it. When can I have an RS4? And he said, I already ordered it for you 2 weeks ago. he just knew that that's what I was going to do. So brand new RS4 arrived like about 4 weeks later. And it was, so like just doing that kind of thing. Flying first class, with my children, who one of them was a baby still in the lap, but the other one was a 2-year-old. So we had to get a seat for her. And I mean, paying like, whatever, €3,000 for a child of 3 to sit in their first class seat. And I bought property in Spain. I bought a nice villa in Spain, and I bought an apartment in America. I had a penthouse in New York City. And I actually had it overlooking the Rockefeller Center ice rink. And so it was pretty spectacular. And so, you could kind of say, wow, at least I enjoyed the kind of the thing. But, the problem is these things come home to roost, So when I joke about it now, and I can kind of like, it's like water off a duck's back at this stage. But there was some really, sort of frivolous moments. And one of the things that I did, I went and got into the stock market, and I bought shares in a gold mine company and in a oil exploration company, and I had lots of money lying around, so I put 150,000 into this thing called a CFD account. And that's anyone who's into trading will know CFDs. You're borrowing the money as well, so you're leveraging up. And that 150,000, within 3 months, I turned that into 850,000. And I was like, what am I going to do? So I went down to the local Porsche garage, and I was like ordering myself the newest 911. And then suddenly the market changed, and they dropped like 400,000 in the space of a week or something like that. And I was like, what's going on? Okay, hold the Porsche. You're going to wait for the market to come back. And it didn't just drop at 400. It went right down to negative. And I ended up losing about 150,000. Having put 150 in, it went to 850. It came all the way back down to zero. And so it was a full swing of over 1 million in the stock market. And that was the kind of crazy stuff that was going on. And I mean, I realize now that I was kind of like a gambler basically, and it was, but it's so easy when you think that the money is coming so easily. You know, it's like it was this success got to my head and kind of just made me think that I could do no wrong. And that's a real lesson to learn, that you're not the genius that created this. You know, there's something else beyond you, and you've got to bear that in mind.
Well, you're very humble the way you put it across, but you've got to be on the pitch to play the game. And, you know, all of us who were around, you know, in the 80s and before, when the market was going up and things were going crazy, not everybody was on the field playing the game. Not everyone could reap the rewards. So you were there. You reaped the rewards quite well deservedly, and you got through it and came to the other side. And you're here to share this phenomenal message with people. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you and, you know, find out more about your story, Gavin. And is there anything, we have gone actually over the hour, so is there anything that you would like to leave people with as we come to a close today?
I mean, if they're interested in hearing more, you know, tune into the podcast, and if they have any specific questions, the podcast has a Facebook group called Behind the Facade Community that you're welcome to join. And apart from that, I have my own personal website, gavinjgallagher.com. And if you go /go, that actually, /go will actually bring you straight to a newsletter sign up. And I don't send out a lot of newsletters because I don't like spam emails myself, but occasionally I'll put out something that I think might be interesting to the audience.
So gavinjgallagher.com, if you want more Gavin, and why wouldn't you? And if you're listening to this on the podcast, then definitely check out the Behind the Facade podcast. And Gavin, I did mean to touch on, so we must just briefly touch on that before we go. You live in the most beautiful place. We see the photos of you and your family. So tell us about where you live now, and this is some of the riches that you indulge in these days.
Dublin is a very picturesque city at a certain time of the morning, I find, and so I start my day pretty much every day with a run or a bike ride, and I go down to the coast, and you know, because we're on the east side of the country, we get the sunrise over the sea, so I take a lot of photographs in the morning of that. So that's what you're referring to, some of the beautiful stuff. And I mean, Dublin is it's a beautiful city. We got the hills very close by, and there's a huge amount of rural kind of scenery and stuff not far from. So I like to get out, and I like to kind of show off the country of my birth. And I did about 10 years of traveling, so it's nice to come back and to kind of to focus on the Irish market.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for joining us. It's been great to learn more about your story. Thank you, Gavin. You are a game changer, and I love what you're doing. Now, we're looking forward to the book, Gavin.
Thank you. Yeah.
I can't wait to pick it up and give it a good read. So thank you also for watching and for listening, and look forward to seeing you again very soon. Bye for now.
Thanks, Stephanie.